The Empty Nature of All Things, Buddhist Philosophy on Reality. Of all the teachings in Buddhism, emptiness might be the one that gets misunderstood the most and argued about the most. Some people hear the word and assume it means nothing here is real. Others turn it into a kind of self-help idea, something you use to convince yourself that nothing matters, so nothing can hurt you. Neither one is what the Buddha meant. Even people who study Buddhism seriously don't fully agree on this one. Some argue the Buddha never actually taught emptiness, not the sweeping version most people associate with Buddhism today. That version, they say, came later, built by philosophers centuries after he died. Here's the actual question underneath all of it, and you can check it against your own experience right now. Take any feeling you've had today. Ask what it was standing on. Keep tracing backward, and you'll find something holding it up every single time, with nothing at the very bottom just standing there on its own. That's what the Buddha meant by empty. Nothing, anywhere, holds itself up alone. To understand what the Buddha meant by empty, it helps to see the to join. In his time, most religious and philosophical debate in India circled around one question. Does a person have a permanent self sitting behind all this experience? Something unchanging and eternal? Or is there truly nothing there at all? No continuity? A monk named Kakana once asked the Buddha directly what counted as right view on this matter, expecting him to pick a side. The exchange survives today as the Kakanagoda Sutta, and in it, the Buddha's answer did neither. People fall into two ideas, he said, that things exist and that things don't exist, and both are traps built from the same mistake. Watch anything closely enough as it arises out of a specific set of conditions, and the idea that it never existed at all falls apart on its own, because clearly something is happening. Watch that same thing ends the moment its conditions end, and the idea that it exists in some solid, permanent way falls apart just as fast, because clearly it didn't last. What's left, once both extremes collapse, is a way of seeing rather than a third opinion to hold. Nothing arises by itself, and nothing continues standing once whatever was holding it up is gone. This carried real weight for him beyond winning an old philosophical argument. Whichever side a person picked exists or doesn't exist, they ended up gripping something tightly. And a tight grip leaves the same kind of mark no matter which side it's defending. Buddhism already had two other words doing similar work by that point. Impermanent, meaning nothing lasts. Not self, meaning nothing has an owner running the show. Both are true, and both leave a gap. Something could be impermanent and still stand on its own 2 feet for the brief time it exists. Self-sufficient for the length of its short life. Something could lack an owner and still be a solid single thing bumping around out there without one. Empty closes that gap. It says there was never a moment, not even one instant, where anything stood free of what was propping it up. Whether at its first appearance, in the middle of its life, or in the heartbeat before it dissolved back into the conditions that made it. This is the sharper of the two claims. There's a detail here that changes the picture considerably. In a text called the Śūnyatā, when the Buddha said the world is empty, his student Ananda pushed him to be specific. Empty of what exactly? Empty of self, the Buddha answered, and empty of anything that could be called one's own. Then he walked through exactly where that applies. The eye and what it sees, the ear and what it hears, on through each of the 6 senses in turn, down to the very last thought your mind just produced. That was the entire territory covered by the word world, galaxies, the universe as a whole. None of that was ever the subject. In a separate teaching called the Sabbha Sutta, the All, he made this same boundary explicit on purpose. He said that if someone claimed there was some other world hiding beyond what the six senses deliver, ask them to explain it, and they wouldn't be able to. He drew that line deliberately. Every question he answered was aimed at ending suffering, and suffering has an address inside a person's actual immediate experience, not in the stars. To call that experience empty was to make one precise claim, nothing more and nothing less. A feeling, a passing thought, the sense of being a fixed self running the show behind your eyes. None of it holds itself up on its own. Every part of it borrows its existence from something else that had to happen first, and every part of it ends the moment those conditions do. Empty of self is the half most people already expect. It's the other half, empty of what belongs to a self, that catches people off guard once they actually sit with it. It's one thing to accept that a feeling isn't a fixed, permanent you. It's a much harder thing to accept that the opinion you hold on to so tightly, the achievement you point to as proof of your worth, the person you love and quietly consider yours, none of it has the fixed, guaranteed connection to you that it feels like it has. Ownership itself, the whole idea of mine, was included in the same verdict as the idea of me. Both were built the same way, out of conditions, and both end the same way, when those conditions stop. Try it with whatever you're feeling right now, or with whatever you'd instinctively call yours. Ask what it's actually resting on. You'll find something underneath it, and that something will need something else underneath it too. On and on. Without ever hitting solid ground, you could call the source, or a boundary you could call truly yours. What just got laid out is still only a claim, even with that quick check at the end. A single glance isn't the same as training the eye to see it reliably, every time. And reliable seeing is what Buddhism has always cared about. There's a meditation the Buddha taught a student, recorded in a text called the Sunyata Sutta, the shorter discourse on emptiness, moving through it step by step. It starts simply, sitting in a busy, crowded place, then letting attention settle instead on something far more uniform, like an empty wilderness. That too gets set aside for something simpler still, an even undifferentiated expanse, then simpler again and again, each step trading a more complicated field of perception for a plainer one. At every single stage, the same instruction repeats like a refrain running underneath the whole exercise. Close to these exact words, it undoes a major misunderstanding of this teaching in one line. The instruction demands total precision about what's actually happening in this moment, refusing to invent what isn't there, and refusing to deny what is. Most minds do the reverse constantly, without ever catching themselves in the act. A passing mood gets promoted to a permanent identity before anyone notices the switch, while the mood itself is already changing underneath that very promotion. The training here interrupts that exact habit at the source. It asks for a kind of honesty most people have never once practiced on themselves, honesty about what's actually there, and what the mind only added afterward. This is easy to mistake for suppression. The difference matters because one of them is actually looking at what's real, and the other is refusing to. Suppression pushes a feeling down and pretends it isn't there, dishonest in the opposite direction from the usual one. What's being trained here runs against both habits at once. The anger gets to be fully seen while it's here, not shrunk, and not turned into a permanent trait. It arrives, gets registered accurately for exactly as long as it lasts, and then it leaves the way everything leaves, because nothing was holding it in place to begin with. The early tradition never taught this kind of seeing in isolation. Two companion practices traveled alongside it, and seeing all three together fills out the picture. One is called the signless, the training to stop automatically painting a fixed image onto every passing thing, since the mind tends to freeze a moving process into a single fixed picture. The other is called the wishless, the training to notice how much of ordinary experience runs on pulling toward what's wanted and pushing away from what isn't. Usually so fast it never even registers as a choice. Emptiness sits alongside both of these, three doors into the same room. All three were trained the way a musician trains an ear, practiced over and over until seeing accurately became the only way of seeing left. Try it on the next feeling that shows up, whatever it happens to be. Watch how much of it is actually there in the moment it arrives. How much of it your mind freezes into a fixed picture within seconds, and how much of it you're already pulling toward or pushing away before it's even finished arriving. So, here's where those leaves things. After everything covered so far from the Buddha's teaching, empty truly meant one exact claim, checked directly, rather than simply taken on faith. Nothing in a person's own experience, not anger, not the sense of being a fixed self, not the thought arising in your head right now, holds itself up on its own. Each one exists only because something else made room for it first. And each one depends entirely on conditions that could just as easily not have been there. A few centuries after the Buddha's death, a monk named Nagarjuna sat with a question that sounds almost obvious once you hear it out loud, and answering it reshaped Buddhism completely. The question was direct and simple. Why would that truth stop at a person? If nothing about you can stand alone, a mountain has no special exemption written into it somewhere. Neither does a number, an idea, a law of physics, or a single passing moment in time. The question had a specific target, sharpened by centuries of scholarship that followed the Buddha's own lifetime. Generations of monks had built increasingly detailed maps of experience, breaking a single moment down into dozens of separate components, each catalogued with its own name and defining trait. The project was careful and well-intentioned, an honest attempt to understand the mind in enough detail to work with it skillfully. Along the way, though, each of those components started getting treated as a small, solid unit in its own right. Even if it only lasted for an instant, Nagarjuna's argument addressed this directly. If something depends on conditions to arise, and every one of these units clearly does, it cannot also carry a trait that belongs to it alone, independent of those conditions. So, the analysis had to go one level deeper, past the level of the person and into the units themselves. He went back to that same exchange with Kakana from centuries earlier, quoted it by name as his proof, and followed the logic all the way to its natural conclusion. Every single thing exists only in dependence on something else, without exception, without some hidden category excused from the rule. He wrote it all down in a text called the Mulamadhyamaka Karika, root verses on the middle way, and compressed the entire argument into one line still quoted today across very different Buddhist traditions that agree on little else. His own words come close to this. What depends on conditions, call that empty. That itself is the middle way, the same one the Buddha had pointed toward from the very beginning, centuries earlier, in a conversation with a single confused student. This is the same reasoning the Buddha used on a person, now carried out to cover everything else too. The logic didn't change, only the destination did. So, the honest answer to whether the sweeping version of emptiness really goes back to the Buddha has two parts. The timing, yes, is centuries later. The reasoning underneath it is entirely his. People heard this and got nervous, understandably. If nothing has a fixed nature anywhere, doesn't that collapse into nihilism sooner or later? Nagarjuna's response was to lay out two levels of truth, working at the same time rather than competing with each other. Day to day, everything keeps working exactly as it appears to. A kind word still lands as a kind word, and a broken promise still breaks something real. Suffering is real and can be addressed through real effort. At a deeper level, none of that functioning ever required a fixed, independent nature to make it real in the first place. A wave doesn't need to be a separate, permanent thing sitting apart from the ocean to count as a real wave. Worth watching, worth riding. It only needs the conditions that keep producing it, moment after moment, for as long as those conditions last, and then it's gone. And the ocean was never short one wave. Mistaking one level for the other creates its own kind of trouble. Treat the everyday level as the only truth, and you end up believing in a fixed, solid self after all, defended and decorated and never questioned. Treat the deeper level as canceling out the everyday one, and you land in the nihilism people were afraid of from the start, using the teaching as an excuse to stop caring about anything. Both mistakes were named and warned against directly, and both truths have to be kept running together, neither one allowed to swallow the other. This is also where Buddhism's quoted line comes from, a short text called the Heart Sutra. Its exact words: form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. People often treat it as a riddle. What it describes is more ordinary than that. The physical world sitting in front of you right now, and its total lack of any fixed nature underneath, were never two separate things to begin with, one hiding behind the other. Emptiness is simply an accurate account of the very world already here, described with nothing left out and nothing added in to make it sound more mysterious than it is. A cup is empty of a fixed, independent cup nature, and is still, at the very same moment, entirely real enough to hold your tea. The same text that says this about a cup in a wave doesn't stop there. It goes on to say the same thing about the Buddha's own teachings, the very framework used to explain emptiness at all. The six senses, empty too. The chain of cause and effect that explains how suffering builds itself, empty too. Even suffering itself and the path out of it get the same treatment. This is the teaching refusing to make a single exception for its own vocabulary, applying its own logic to itself. A set of directions to a destination isn't something you keep repeating once you've arrived. No explanation, however careful, was ever meant to be the thing itself, only a way of pointing toward it. A reality with nothing fixed inside it reaches directly into how a mind works, starting with where most of its suffering actually comes from. Almost all human suffering runs on one mechanism, repeating itself in 1,000 different disguises. The mind takes something that was only ever moving, a feeling, a relationship, a version of yourself, a single mistake made on a single afternoon, and freezes it in place. Someone says one careless thing at a dinner table, and years later, it's still being replayed as proof of exactly who they are. This is who I am. This is permanent, whether I like it or not. That freezing does far more damage than the original thing ever could have done on its own. A feeling moving through you is uncomfortable for a while. A feeling locked in as your identity becomes something you carry for years. And identity is a much harder thing to put down than a feeling ever was, because you've stopped experiencing it and started defending it. The same freezing happens to everything a person calls mine, not only to the sense of me. A friendship goes quiet for a few months, and it gets filed away as proof that people always leave. A single failure at something you cared about gets promoted into a permanent verdict on your talent, closing a door that a bad week never actually had the authority to close. What belonged to you was never any more fixed than you were. It borrowed its shape from conditions too, and those conditions were always going to keep moving, whether anyone gave them permission or not. Seeing emptiness clearly undoes that mechanism at its root, by showing accurately that nothing was ever frozen to begin with, no matter how convincing the freeze felt at the time. The version of you that made that mistake years ago was a moment, built entirely out of conditions, exhaustion, fear, bad information, old wounds that no longer exist anywhere in the world. What happened still happened, and nothing here excuses it or pretends it away. What changes is simpler than that. The life sentence attached to the event was added afterward by you in the retelling, and it was never actually part of the original moment. Here, Nagarjuna's argument stops being abstract and turns personal. Something with a truly fixed, independent nature could never become anything else by definition. A permanently angry person could never grow calm under those terms, since that would require one fixed thing to somehow turn into a different fixed thing, which cancels itself out logically before it even gets started. Healing, under those terms, would have been impossible from day one. Change is only available at all because nothing was ever locked into a fixed shape, including you, including the people who hurt you, including the worst thing that ever happened to either of you. This cuts in a second direction too, toward the people other than you. Deciding that someone else is simply like that, permanently, with no possible other way to be, does the identical thing to them and locks you into a relationship with a fixed idea instead of an actual moving person. The same absence of fixed nature that lets you change is the same absence that lets them change too, whether or not they ever do. Meaning, love. The slow effort to become someone steadier than you were yesterday. All of it depends on the very thing this word points to. Nothing had to stay fixed for any of it to be real or worth doing. This dependency is the whole reason any of it was ever possible to begin with. An unfinished world was always the real subject of this word, still being built one dependent moment at a time, including whichever moment you happen to be sitting in right now.